We've laid the foundation for a lot of the issues related to media and society, and now we will start going through some of the different forms of media, beginning with the original form of mass media, the newspaper, as we address some of the issues in Chapter 4. In Chapter 4, we get a bit of the history of newspapers in the United States and then try to address different styles and models of journalism. We try to think a bit about access to information and the effect on popular culture, look at some current industry trends, and think especially about the role of online journalism and what that means to the world of journalism today. So you might make note of a couple of links on the outline. These are long documentaries, so we're not trying to use these as a significant part of the class, but you might find them useful. And so there's one called Page One that's a documentary on the New York Times media desk and the changing landscape of journalism that was done about 9 years ago. And then another one where Carl Bernstein talks about journalism today. Those give a little bit more insight than our chapter does into what's happened with journalism in recent times. So think about the history of newspapers. The first occurred in the 1600s in Europe after the invention of the printing press. And if we look at the United States, and of course the evolution from England to the United States has a significant impact on the way that colonial newspapers occurred. The first began in 1690, a one and done newspaper. It was a politically motivated paper that came from a newspaper publisher out of England. And then after that, the couple of other ones that our book talks about from Boston and Philadelphia, they tried to be non-political in those early years of the 1700s. But by the 1720s, we started getting papers wanting to try to take a point of view again, leading up to a significant case historically, which is about John Peter Zenger, who was sued by the New York colonial governor for something he had published, but he was acquitted in his trial, and it's important to look back at the reasoning for that our book talks a little bit about. And so the John Peter Zenger case is an important case in terms of freedom of the press. So again, trying to just kind of look at the survey of the historical things, we go up to the period of the 1830s, and we have what's called the penny press. And so our chapter helps us to appreciate a bit about how expensive it was to actually print the papers, but finding a way by this time period to print them cheaper and to get the paper into more people's hands. And so the penny press and that period in the 1830s is an important part of the history of American newspaper publishing. We also then kind of jump over to what's called the yellow journalism period in the 1800s. And that's focused on people like Joseph Pulitzer at the New York World and William Randolph Hearst at the New York Journal. Hearst's life was a little bit of the basis for the classic 1941 film Citizen Kane, and Pulitzer, of course, had a big impact on journalism, as did Hearst. Sensationalism came along as part of yellow journalism. It is the predecessor to what we now think of as being the tabloids and the way that news is covered. And this is the time period that we recognize the first stunt journalist who went by the pen name of Nellie Bly. And of course, this style of journalism was attention-getting. It wasn't what we would think of as being good, solid journalism. And it was a threat to a paper like the New York Times that was trying to be more serious journalism, while these other entities were really trying to just draw attention to their publication and make money from that. So despite the sometimes questionable tactics of Hearst and Pulitzer, each of those people made significant contributions to the growing journalism industry. By 1922, Hearst had created the country's largest media holding company. At that time, he owned 20 daily newspapers, 11 Sunday papers, 2 wire services, 6 magazines, and a newsreel company. Pulitzer also turned his focus in his later years to establishing a school of journalism. In 1912, a year after his death, and 10 years after he had begun his educational campaign, classes opened at the Columbia University School of Journalism. At that time of its opening, the school had about 100 students from 21 countries, and we can trace that as being kind of the start of journalism education. And then, of course, you should know about the Pulitzer Prize. In 1917, the first one of those was awarded for excellence in journalism. So then what about styles and models? Well, we tend to kind of talk about journalism as if it should be neutral, unbiased, objective. And at some level through our American history of newspapers, that's come and gone. Early newspapers clearly had some political slants to them. But the idea of objectivity really became ingrained in the New York Times in the late 1800s. And the idea of having impartiality, of just reporting the facts and all the news that's fit to print. During this time period, we started seeing the inverted pyramid style as a writing style for journalism, and that's where the most important information in the story leads, and then the next most important information down to the least important. We also look at this time period in the 1800s with the introduction of the telegraph, of being able to send news quickly from place to place, and a news organization that still is significant as a co-op of a shared resource for collecting and distributing news. It started as a result of this relationship between some major newspapers, their ability to use telegraph to share information. That's the beginning of the Associated Press that our book helps us to appreciate a bit about. So what about styles and models then? Interpretive journalism. Journalists use it to explain issues and to provide readers with a broader context for the stories they encounter. And that's not the same exactly as investigative journalism, but it is a beginning point of that concept of not just covering the facts of something going on, but to dig deeper into that and give people some context of things that are going on. And then looking at a different style in journalism through the years, the one that's called literary journalism, and Truman Capote's In Cold Blood is a good demonstration of that. It's often referred to as new journalism. At the time that it came out, it was a new approach toward what people thought of as journalism. It combines factual reporting with sometimes fictional narration, is intended to bring voice and character to historical events. Advocacy journalism is where the journalists promote a particular cause and intentionally adopt a biased, non-objective viewpoint to get their cause across. And then there's issues in looking at this and kind of just different ways we might do journalism and the comparison of consensus versus conflict journalism. Consensus journalism tends to be what smaller market areas have, where the newspapers try to go out and cover just the local events, cover city council meetings and so forth. And then larger market areas like Dallas, Fort Worth would have things that fall into being more conflict journalism. And then we also get a little sense in the chapter of what's called niche journalism areas, certain specialized types of publications, and then also underground newspapers. But what ultimately does a news organization do? It is a matter of covering things that people need to know about or want to know about and deciding which stories to cover. And so we recognize that role as a gatekeeper. A gatekeeper role means that you have 20 different items and you only get to use 10 of them. Which of those 10 get to go through the gate? The ones that you eliminate, you've made a decision about how newsworthy they were, and therefore you've had an impact on what people see as being important because they don't get to know about the ones that you decided not to cover. So that gatekeeper role is an important part in control of information. And then, of course, part of journalism is developing the right resources and developing those relationships that allow you to have access and to be able to cover materials that might be of interest to your audience or might be really needed information for your audience. We talk about the concept of watchdog journalism, that the watchdog looks out for things that are going on and warns us. And so the journalist can be a watchdog for us to tell us what's going on in our community and especially in our government. The book also helps us to appreciate how radio and television, when they came along in the 1900s, had a threat to print journalism, and newspapers had to adapt by the 1950s, especially in 60s, as radio was very well established and TV was really flourishing. And then, of course, now those entities, along with newspapers, are threatened by the internet and everything that we can do online these days. So in the current trends, the chapter helps us to think about the fact of the declining readership and revenues of newspapers, the competition that exists from web operations, from blogging. We have people that are called citizen journalists that do blogging, and then there's that debate, are they really journalists? And so within access to information. The newspaper can run advertising and make their money that way, or they can put up paywalls. They've had to try to develop some partnerships, and some news convergence activities have happened in recent decades, and then branding of the work that they do. And of course, as the chapter tells us, where most of the news activity, the actual news gathering occurs, is within these newspaper organizations. So it's important to recognize their significance, even if they're not printing and having hard copies of newspapers. They still are news gathering entities. So at the time of our book being published, they showed us kind of where does the money come from. So the advertising coming from 46% as part of their budget, circulation, sales of subscriptions, about 27%. At that time, the digital advertising was 11%, and some of the new revenue in the niche marketing also then accounted for 8% each. What we would see clearly these days is more paywalls would be figured into that, and more online advertising would be figured into that. So why are all these issues important? Well, as we said, most news stories today originate from these print publications. They're still the largest existing news operations, and we also can recognize that other industries are and will be disrupted by technology, just as the news and broadcast businesses have been. And just as a few simple examples, the whole world of taxi business were changed by Uber and Lyft and services like that, the ride-sharing services. All the traditional kinds of stores like Sears are in trouble, while Amazon is making huge amounts of money as an online-based retailer. So that's some of our main ideas from Chapter 4 about the development of newspaper and their importance in our society. Let's do a bit of some review of some of the main things here. So September 25th, 1690 was the date of the first newspaper published in the American colonies, whose publisher had been a newspaper editor in England, but the publication folded after just one issue. So our book tells us that is Benjamin Harris's public occurrences, both foreign and domestic. The first regularly published newspapers in the American colonies included two in what city and one in what city. The chapter kind of helps us get a sense of the colonies starting newspapers, and so those happened in Boston and Philadelphia. Although the first regular newspapers in the American colonies avoided politics for the early part of the 1700s, politics re-entered American papers in 1721 with an article criticizing smallpox inoculations in New England. And what was that paper? It was Ben Franklin's brother's paper, James Franklin's New England Current. The acquittal from the jury in the trial and the government's prosecution of newspaper publisher John Peter Zenger demonstrated what two things? Well, it showed that papers could potentially print honest criticism of the government without fear of retribution, an important starting point to freedom of the press, and the British became afraid that an American jury would never convict an American journalist, also allowing more freedoms in publications. As late as the early 1800s, newspapers were still quite expensive to print until Benjamin Day created the Sun in New York. And based on that 1 cent paper, it was a period that became known as the penny press. Invention of the telegraph allowed newspapers to receive up-to-date news briefs from cities across the globe, leading to the formation of a cooperative in 1846. That cooperative, as a news-gathering entity that started by these 5 New York newspapers, is the Associated Press, that still exists and is still important to news gathering in the world today, based in the United States. In the late 1800s, New York world publisher Joseph Pulitzer developed a new journalistic style that relied on an intensified use of sensationalism. And therefore, that period became known as yellow journalism. Although many would not consider them objective today, what is it that's credited with starting a trend in American journalism of objective journalism? That is the New York Times in the late 1800s. During the 1930s, two major events increased the desire for a new style of journalism: the Great Depression and the Nazi threat to global stability, and that new style was called interpretive journalism. Stemming from the development of interpretive journalism, what was it that began to emerge during the 1960s, made popular by journalists Tom Wolfe, Truman Capote? It combines factual reporting with sometimes fictional narration, and that is what we call literary journalism. Chapter 4 tells us that what kind of journalism typically takes place in smaller communities where local newspapers generally serve as a forum for many different voices and where the papers provide meeting notices and run articles on local schools and events, government, property crimes, zoning issues. Compared to that, which style is it that is presented in more national, international news articles in the New York Times and occurs in the larger metropolitan areas? So that's a discussion in our chapter about consensus journalism versus conflict journalism. In terms of readers' expectations of being told the truth, the New York Times reporter lost his job in 2003 when he plagiarized and fabricated content and stories, and then which New Republic journalist was fired in 1998 for inventing stories, quotes, and sources. So that's helping us to appreciate that every now and then there are people who are called journalists who kind of lie about what they're reporting and lose their jobs. And so we know about people like Jason Blair from the Times and Stephen Glass from the New Republic. And what kind of journalism that provides the public with information about government officials or business owners while holding those officials to high standards of operation. We call that watchdog journalism. What papers had the highest circulation at our time our book was published? So it was USA Today, and then the Wall Street Journal, and then the New York Times. Well, today it's still the same, except New York Post on that list is now number 4, and then the LA Times and the Washington Post. Print newspapers have been in trouble financially for some time. The most significant challenge to newspapers comes from the internet. What have offered a new take on the traditional world of journalism featuring online news and commentary entries for one or more authors, but journalists differ on whether or not what they do is actually a form of journalism. Those are coming from blogs, bloggers, and what we would call citizen journalists. As a sign of the times for newspapers, which Seattle paper in 2009 stopped printing and went to online only, leaving the rival Seattle Times as the only big daily in town. Chapter tells us about the Post-Intelligencer. And as always, as we wrap up, be sure to read the chapter, get the details of things we've hit the highlights on, and see the end of the chapter assessment for more review over Chapter 4, the newspaper business.